Hi, so I wanted to do a little video then, just talking a little bit about Epstein and his association with Noam Chomsky. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about what could appear to be deep-seated misogyny with regards to Chomsky and why it's a bit of a problem. So I know a lot of people will have been really disappointed to find one of their heroes in the Epstein files, and as such, a few people are already trying to downplay it. His second wife, Valeria, his current wife, has already sought to downplay it. You know, she's trying to paint him as some sort of wide-eyed, trusting fanboy who just took it in good faith that Epstein, was talking about some minor misdemeanor. And we're supposed to take that at face value. And I don't think it's good enough. And I don't think it holds water. Some people suggest, well, maybe as Chomsky's aged, he might have lost some faculties. Well, he did have a stroke in 2023, a significant one. However, at the time of learning about Epstein, he would have presumably been relatively in charge of his faculties. The idea that he's just some wide-eyed kid trusting a friend holds absolutely no water at all. It might if it was just a regular person on the street, but this isn't just a regular man on the street. This is Noam Chomsky. You know, he's a huge deal politically, being a sort of political activist, talking against, rallying people against exploitative systems, etc. He's also known as a bit of a leader regards linguistics as well. He is a leader himself, and he's hugely influential, and he has a powerful analytical mind. And you mean to tell me that he just switched off his brain regards his friend, took it all at face value? No. And he's named in the files for at least one reason. There might be more, but because basically Epstein reached out to him in 2019, shortly before he was arrested, to complain about the media coverage to do with all of his sex crimes, etc. And by then, Chomsky would have been well aware as to what he stood accused of. That is part of the problem here. This wasn't just a youngster being too trusting or naive. This is someone who would have read a lot of the press coverage. He'd have been well aware. In 2018, there was a great deal of press coverage. That's when it all exploded. And I believe in the US, the Miami Herald had pretty much serialized it in great detail. Chomsky would have been well aware before then that there were issues because of the 2008 plea deal, citing sex with a minor. And he had to register, Epstein had to register following that as a sex offender. In 2011, Virginia Giuffre started to speak out. And since then, Epstein and Chomsky had enjoyed quite a close association. But in 2018, Chomsky would have become fully apprised of what the media was talking about. Very unlikely that he would have just taken Epstein's word for something. This is a man who doesn't take people's word for things. He's got an analytical mind. And so his response matters. How he chose to respond matters. And when Epstein complained, Chomsky responded by seeking to play down the crimes. And that's the disturbing part of this to me. You know, he had a choice how he could have responded. He could have cut off contact after 2008 or 2011. And once he'd read that media coverage, he could have quietly cut off contact then. But after Epstein specifically wrote to him complaining about this media coverage, etc., Chomsky had a choice. And at that point, he could have just said, look, I don't want anything more to do with you, etc. That would have been the correct response, right? Morally. What he chose to do instead was play it down completely. Talk about how there was a problem with the hysteria of women who had been abused. Now, that statement, if a direct quote, pretty much is in itself a problem, because it doesn't deny culpability, right? It seeks to make the problem, the hysteria, the response regarding abuse. It doesn't seek to say there's no abuse. It seeks to say that there's a problem with the response, that hysteria is not a correct response to abuse. And that, to me, is a horrific response. You know, aside from the fact he then goes on to ameliorate the whole thing, play it down, he advises Epstein to ignore everything, you know? And then he talks about the, how terrible it is. Poor Epstein, who's been hounded in such a way. Chomsky's wife, for her part, Valeria, says, well, Chomsky just wasn't aware. He thought he'd done his time for the particular crime and he should therefore be left alone, and he wasn't aware of anything else. My thoughts on this are, if you're a man at the top of your career and your career has been to analyse, dissect powerful societies and how they're run, to sort of take apart notions such as capitalism, look into exploitation, etc. And you've had a glittering career, and your career has sort of hinged upon being a bit of a voice for the oppressed as much as anything else. And then here you are with a friend with very questionable ethics and morals, who himself has had to register as a sex offender. And then things start blowing up in the press and you discover that there's quite a lot going on. Do you continue to naively trust and believe in your friend? Or do you look into it? Do you start reading about it? And when you've read about it, do you come to a different conclusion? Or do you seek to try and soften, try and make the whole thing go away? And it matters. It matters because Chomsky himself is a really influential figure. People look up to him, you know. He had a duty of care, not only to his own reputation, but to all of the people who look up to him. You know, if he'd have come out publicly and distanced himself from Epstein, he could have further helped to support the victims and give them a bit of a voice and give them a bit of credibility at a time when they were still being very much questioned. You know, people were still a bit skeptical. They weren't too sure what to believe. People like Chomsky and his opinions matter. And the whole thing is really, really indicative of the sort of supporting infrastructure, you know. Epstein was able to operate the way he did, not just because there's a huge network, it would seem, of paedophiles in all sorts of places in society, in every, in every industry, in every part of society, but also the enablers, the people that helped prop them up. There's this whole supporting architecture. And it's people like Noam Chomsky then who matter, because he's got a voice. He's got a hell of an important voice and a hell of a part to play. If he'd have publicly distanced himself from and looked to support the victims at that moment, the power that it could have given them, the support that it could have given them. But instead, he chose to talk about the hysteria of women, the hysteria of the response regarding abuse. What? Eve Ensler wrote in a 2014 article in The Guardian, in the Vagina Monologues, she herself was an abuse victim and a writer and a playwright. And she was absolutely of the opinion hysteria is a correct response. We need outrage. We need a little fire in our bellies when we're reading about these cases, don't we? Part of the problem is either people who don't want to look, they look away, or people who then seek to ameliorate, to turn away from, to seek to soften the crimes. All of that helps prop up a really sick world, So to me, it matters. It really matters. And I was having a bit of a chat about this online with somebody who clearly themselves was a huge fan of Chomsky, and they wanted to sidestep that completely and still sort of promote Chomsky's work. And I thought, wow, to me, that speaks to the part of the human brain that can fall into easy cognitive dissonance. Again, helping to unwittingly enable, the darker part of the human psyche. We have to notice what's going on, and we have to acknowledge it, even and especially with regard to our heroes, She was also employing devices like whataboutery, talking about, well, why are you talking about him when, there are other people who are far more involved? And yes, obviously, the people who were very involved, they absolutely need holding to account in the highest possible way. There's no question about that. But we need to examine everybody who was involved to whatever degree. It all matters because it all helps to prop up this architecture of abuse, And I think it really speaks to a potential huge misogyny within Noam Chomsky. And when you think of the generation he was born into, there would have been very much that sense of misogyny kind of baked into societal thinking at the time. And I think it really speaks to that. And I think it's really important that we look at that and consider that, because given his stature, given his status in society, what an influential figure he was. And here he is casually advising his friend Jeffrey Epstein to ignore the media coverage, to not to worry about the hysteria of the response about abuse. It's just hysteria, There's this implicit idea that abuse is okay on some level, that it shouldn't need a response like that. And Chomsky, as I say, he didn't become sick until a few years later. 2023, he suffered a huge stroke. Valeria has sought to downplay it all and say that poor Chomsky, he was duped by his friend. But playing the innocent card here doesn't fly, that he regrets his association type of thing. Well, if you look at the number of people now who are regretting their association, the list is long. Bill Clinton regrets his association. Prince Andrew, ex-Prince Andrew, regrets his association, etc. Everybody regrets it. Everybody had this terrible error of judgment, it seems. All of these people who are very high up in some way or another, who have held quite high positions, which sort of demand excellent judgment skills, suddenly had terrible lapses in judgment. Are we to believe that this man this absolute juggernaut of sort of political, analytical inquiry is suddenly reduced to a bumbling teenager who's just temporarily lost his mind and trusted his mate. And oh, poor Chomsky got completely let down. You know, he was perfectly capable of scouring those newspaper reports. And he clearly noted enough. It isn't good enough to say either, oh, he wouldn't have been well aware of what was going on. The very fact that he seeks to talk about the hysteria of the media response itself tells us he was well aware of what was going on, of how Epstein was being viewed and what Epstein had potentially done, the crimes he committed. So to then seek to downplay that is horrendous. And if Noam Chomsky can do that, who's considered a sort of people's hero, who else carried that level of misogyny that thought that abuse was kind of normal or okay or shouldn't have such a hysterical response? It's just women being hysterical, you know? And all of this is important because I feel like we're in this sort of mad historical time, a time we're not going to see again with regards to the level of sheer horror, the amount of abuse. And this one man, who it seems was pivotal in all of it. And so we have a responsibility, you know, not just for us, but for future generations and all of his victims. We have a real duty of care to turn over every stone, to look at everyone's association, to examine attitudes, critically examine attitudes, you know, and to try to work out how this had been enabled for so long. And I think there are so many reasons that it has been. One of those reasons is perhaps a baked-in misogyny that's been an undercurrent of society for so long. Another reason is that our society itself is sick. Many years ago, the man who brought Buddhism to the West, Jiddu Krishnamurti, said, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And he said that in around the 1950s. He wasn't wrong, and it's worse now, you know? Our whole society is pretty much built on corruption. We've put profit above everything, above healthcare, above animals, above people, above our own planet. And we're all suffering for it. We're all the more impoverished for this system we've created that seeks to enslave mankind, keep them robotic in their jobs, pay them very little, and ask that they don't analyse, they don't question, they just kind of follow orders, you know. Our society is deeply, deeply sick. And it's been this way for a long time. And I believe that how we respond to this whole crisis matters. You know, responding with apathy isn't good enough. We can't expect anybody else to just come in and swoop in and magically pick up the pieces here. We all have a part to play, all of us. How we respond to events in our own lives, even on a micro level, matters. Many of these people were getting away with what they got away with because they completely divorced their heads from their hearts. They were these intellectuals who thought being heart-centred didn't matter. But if you shut your heart off, it can lead to cruelty, sometimes extreme cruelty. I think this whole debacle has shown us that as well. And so how we respond now matters. We've become really divorced from our spirituality. And that matters too. You know, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. We're eternal spiritual beings, literally born from a loving entity that, you know, a loving sort of consciousness. We're a part of it. It's the most extraordinary thing, and yet many of us are deeply unaware of that. Many spiritual leaders have come along and tried to wake us all up en masse and say, hey, come on, you know, don't get too attached to the material world. It isn't real. It's a pretty illusion, but it isn't real. And we end up ignoring those people and just carrying on as we are. But we can't just keep carrying on anymore. The more divorced we are from our spiritual selves, the more we try and cut ourselves off from our hearts, the harder and colder and more corrupt our society becomes. And so we need to make inroads. And it starts with us, it starts with all of us. And there needs to be a recognition of the basics of psychology as well, the basics of a bit of self-awareness. Cognitive dissonance is part of the reason we have allowed this situation to continue. We look the other way. We find ways to tell ourselves stories about society that seek to ameliorate, that seek to play down the horrors so that we can carry on in our daily lives without having to think too much about it. But we need to bear witness to these times, difficult though it is. We can't change what we don't look at, but we really can make changes here. I'm absolutely certain that we have the ability to make some deep-seated changes. It's just a question of whether or not we're going to take this and use it as an opportunity to do something a bit different. These crimes are so horrific and it's so widespread, and we're not going to be able to do it overnight, but we have to play a role. We can't just sit back anymore. We have to get a bit more involved in one way or another, you know? So it matters. It all matters. Chomsky's views are completely shocking in this regard. We need to be horrified. You know, we need to absolutely be able to call it, be able to draw a line, be able to recognise when people have crossed that line. And it doesn't matter if there are heroes, all the more reason then, you know, this isn't attacking the person for no reason, etc. This is attacking hard-baked, hard-wired views that are repugnant, that have no place in a modern society. And it's extraordinary. I think the level of this is it's gonna reverberate for many years to come. But I really feel like it offers a potential for change. But we need to be able to see through the bullshit. We need to be able to recognise that there is a dark side of humanity. And it's also within us to some degree, not to the extent that it's in some of these people. You know, these the Epsteins of this world are absolute psychopaths. There's no doubt about it. But the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment, for example, tell us that we all have an ability to turn a bit of a blind eye, to be a bit sheep-like, to follow orders, to not be quite as rational and objective and clear and, you know, switched on as we'd like to be. And COVID too showed us how we all blindly followed orders, etc. It's only now that we're finding out that, you know, the mainstream view wasn't necessarily quite what it was painted there either. Speaking out is really important. Speaking out even when, and especially when, other people around you have a different view. If you hold a very different view to others, it's really important that you're able to say it, that you're able to speak out, that you're able to interrogate everyone, even a good friend. You know, some people said, well, Chomsky was probably dazzled. Who hasn't been dazzled by someone, you know, who's quite famous, etc. Chomsky himself was very famous, was very well known, and it wouldn't have been his first rodeo talking to difficult or dark characters. There are problems in the far right that we all know of. The far right is absolutely hideous. But the left wing has its problems too. they can be a bit woolly, a little bit too liberal, and sometimes a lot too liberal. You know, I always think there's a middle ground between the left and the right that is probably the healthiest place that we need to find. You know, the idea of letting him off, oh, well, he was just a bit dazzled. He was just a bit old. He didn't really know what he was doing. We cannot let these views just be the dominant view regarding this, because it doesn't get to the truth. It doesn't get to what was going on. We need to find out what was going on, what views he held, how they might form a bigger picture in society, because then we can do something differently. You know, if we're just going to follow the ideas of other people blindly, and we're just going to assume, oh, well, maybe he was a bit old, etc., it doesn't get to the heart of the problem. And what we don't get to the heart of problems, when we don't get to the heart of them, well, we're just doomed to repeat them. You know, we're already repeating an awful lot of problems, and we have to be able to look at them with complete honesty, even if it's something that's uncomfortable. And then we have to be prepared to make changes. Otherwise, none of this goes away, and it all just repeats in different ways. Putting people on pedestals is part of the problem. No one deserves a pedestal, you know? People can have fantastic ideas, and that's great, but they're still human and they're still fallible. And all of this shows us that they are all too fallible. So I believe there is hope for the future, potentially, but we have to be willing to use this as a springboard to make some really deep-seated changes, to ask the awkward questions, and to look at the things that we don't really want to look at and acknowledge. And only then can we start making the changes, coming back to our hearts, coming back to our spirituality a little bit, coming back to the truth of what's really real, what really matters. Stop worshipping all the wrong things, greed, money, fame, power, all of that is absolute bullshit. Coming back to what's authentic and real and worth a damn. And maybe then we can make some really good changes, you know. So just some thoughts. Take care. Good night. God bless.